All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to Circle Circle Dot Dot. I'm Bill Waller. Today I'm going to continue the little bit of overview of my view of the 12 principles of animation and how I categorize them and add sort of priority to where I want to focus to try to make my animation better as I'm going through probably a commercial project where time might be limited and I've got to make those types of decisions. So last time I did the stream, we talked about things that were related to timing or temporal things. Timing and spacing and easing were the three things that we covered. And the reason I covered those first and probably spent more time on those than I'm going to spend on any of the other ones is because of just how important they are as the bedrock of animation. I firmly believe that through all of the times that I was teaching animation at the art institutes, it was always really easy to see which students had a grasp of timing and spacing because their animation would always feel better. Technically, it would still have some issues, but it would always just feel like they knew what things should time out to be. So that's why it's a little hard for people to grasp timing sometimes, is because it just comes down to whether or not it feels right. So that's why I spent a little bit of time talking about that. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to move on. Still talking about the foundations and principles of animation. I had categorized them into timing based things, spatial based things, and emotional things. And I had mentioned that to me it makes more sense to put more effort and work into getting better initially at timing and then moving on to spacing and then moving on to emotional things. So what we're going to work on today, what we're going to talk about today, are these four spatial ideas of arcs, anticipation, follow through, and variation. We're going to start out talking about why arcs are so important in motion in general, but why are they so difficult to get right in computer animation. And first of all, we need to identify what arcs are. So arcs are a simple idea. They are the idea that all things in the natural world tend to want to move in arcs of some sort. Specifically, when you're dealing with joint chains in the body, the way it moves, it almost exclusively moves in arcs, and that's because we're a skeleton. Things are hinged and rotational. When you are moving your arm in a swinging motion because you're walking, that's really just because your wrist is attached to your elbow and your elbow is attached to your shoulder. So as your shoulder starts to move, your wrist has to follow along, and it's rotating around the pivot point of your shoulder, which is causing your wrist to move in an arc. Almost everything in your body wants to move in an arc because of the way you're built. But aside from just the way you're built, it tends to just show up in nature this way. Ballistic arcs, the way things fly in the air because of gravity, they want to fly in arc type shapes instead of straight lines. So the reason you have to work at this so much more, I feel like, in computer animation is because we get this illusion in computer animation that things are easy because the computer fills in the gaps. It does something called interpolate. And interpolation is a fancy math term that basically says I know two values at the beginning and end, and I'm going to use an algorithm to fill in the middle. Sometimes it's a simple algorithm. Sometimes if it's an object moving 100 pixels over 10 frames, it divides 100 by 10, and you get 10. Are we going where? Sometimes it's a really simple algorithm. So you divide 100 pixels of motion over 10 frames, and you get 10 pixels of motion per frame, and that's a linear algorithm. So the issue is that programs want things, math, the easiest math is to let things move in straight lines. So a computer can do it really well, but in nature it's really hard to make something move in a perfectly straight line. So what you have to do as an animator is fight with the computer to bend the path of things through space. So that's why it takes a little bit of effort, I think, in computer animation, because as you're drawing things, you're just drawing them in the path that feels right, and you get to choose every single frame where it goes. But when you let a computer interpolate things for you, it's going to plot it on that straight path. In After Effects specifically, there is an interesting thing that happens where After Effects deals with position data like I'm speaking about it now. It separates the idea of it spatially from temporally. So you can have a speed curve of something where your arm might be moving in your object might be moving in an arc, and it can slow down and then speed up in the middle and then slow down in the end, and that can be separate from a motion path that you draw on the screen that actually draws it as an arc. Those two things are different data associated with those two keyframes on either side. Other programs like Maya and Cinema 4D, they don't deal with it like that. It is basically your keyframe has a tangent coming in and out of it, and X position, Y position, and Z position are all separate data points. The reason After Effects has to have it the way it does is because it smooshes your X and Y, and if you have a Z, it smooshes them into one data point, basically, or one keyframe. So unless you go through and separate your keyframes into dealing with X and Y separately, you're going to get this separation of spatial versus temporal. So that's an After Effects specific issue. So you end up with these handles on the screen for your motion path that you have to work with and make it look right. So it can take some time to get used to breaking your mind apart from thinking, okay, I'm going to work with how fast my object is going versus where my object is going. So next on the list would be anticipation. Here's arcs. Got that. Okay, and now let's talk about anticipation and what anticipation is. It's the idea that when an object needs to move in one direction, if it moves too quickly, sometimes the audience can get, or the person viewing, whatever, can get taken off guard by the motion, and their brains don't have time to perceive it. So if this ball were to just suddenly jump without any sort of anticipation, it might seem very unnatural that it was able to do that. So one of the things that you can do, and this is something that when the original Disney animators were really refining their craft, they realized that if they gave their audience a little bit of a preparatory motion, their brains would understand and sometimes would predict what the character was about to do. So you can take these ideas from character animation and smoosh them back into motion graphics just by understanding that if motion is too dramatic right out of the gate, an audience might not quite understand what's coming. This is a very exaggerated example, this squishy ball jumping, but the idea is pretty sound. Typically, if you're dealing with an anticipation, the idea is that it's going to not just pause before it goes to the other side, but it's actually going to move in the opposite direction. Sometimes when you're dealing with character stuff, though, it's even more subtle. It's things like just if your character is standing before they go to walk off the screen, a really subtle weight shift. If they're going to leave off to screen right, they might want to plant their left foot before they go off to the right. This idea of anticipation just pushes the feeling that whatever is happening on the screen is intentional and is not just haphazardly done. In characters, it tends to start pushing the idea that they are a thinking, living creature. It's one of the best ways to start injecting that into your animation. Okay. So the next one should have been follow through and overlapping action. So similar to easing, this one really comes back to physical principles of inertia and momentum and how things move in the real world. Objects that have a lot of mass or a lot of momentum tend to overshoot their final resting position a little bit. So that idea is follow through. It takes a minute for all of that mass to slow down and then settle into place. That's kind of it's easy to think about if you were to throw a tennis ball at somebody, when the tennis ball hit their hand, the momentum of the tennis ball is not that great because it has a small amount of mass. So the tennis ball hitting their hand might bump their hand back a little bit. But take a bowling ball and throw it at them at the same speed. When the bowling ball hits their hand, it'll take, it might take them all the way down to the ground. So that's the best way to think about follow through. Is it just things that are in, it's Newton's laws, things that are in motion tend to want to stay in motion. So slowing them down, they tend to overshoot and follow through on their action. That's closely tied to this idea of overlapping action, which is that if an object is made up of a chain of objects that have children, the one closest to the root of motion might stop first, but that slowdown is going to ripple through the children. It's been called the successive breaking of joints before, or just overlapping action. The idea that that momentum, all parts of the body wouldn't stop all at the same time. So in this little example, it's just like a tail that is stopping, and you get the follow through of the main top part of the tail overshooting, but then the overlapping action of the individual pieces slowing down also. Lastly, we're going to talk about rhythm and variation. So this is something that does not exist as one of the 12 principles of animation at all. And the reason I think that that's important is because of what happens when we animate with computers. We tend to animate a lot by just letting the computer do the work, and that's a theme that I talk about a lot in this. But a lot of animators, just when they're getting started with the process, they let the computer decide what's happening in between a lot of their poses. And to me, I think that it could be as simple as going through. It's something that I did with this little example here. It's a very subtle thing that you might not be able to pick up on, but with every swing of the arms here, there's a slight variation of how far the arms swing, which arm swings furthest, where the breaking points are for the overlap. All of that stuff is bumped slightly. And it's nothing that you have to go through and go hog wild on and just start grabbing your keyframes and moving them around and going weird with them. It could just be subtle little things, and this would definitely be like after your main part of the animation is figured out and you know what you're doing. You can go through and add variation to things. Really what the variation part of it does is adds visual interest. I think it's a great way to make a character look like it has a lot more personality. And again, I don't even think this is definitely character based. If you just have text that's moving in a certain way, or you have a graphical element, a design element that's in motion, and it's in a repetitive motion, it would help to build some variation into that motion. I would also say it's not just the wear of things, because what that was with that animation, for the most part, the variation was in the wear. It was basically in how far each swing went and how far each part of the chain rotated. That's sort of what I would consider it's a wear. But there's also a whole idea of varying your character's entire actions and adding variation to things that they are doing. So if you think about one of the classic examples that I have read is the idea of a boxer throwing a punch, a cartoonish boxer throwing a punch, and they're standing there and they are going, the idea is they take 2 steps and punch. I think a beginning animator would come in and step, punch, and they would do exactly what was called for, 2 steps and a punch. They would divide the time up evenly. But there is a ton that you could get out of changing the timing, and each one would say something different. If you decided that you were going to step and then step punch, the punch would be a snap that comes out of nowhere. Or if you were to step and then punch, there could be this really long drawn back punch, or anticipation to the punch that would be a totally different feeling than the step punch snappiness. And both are more interesting than just step step, punch. So adding variation to your timing is equally important to adding variation to all of the spatial things having to do with your animation. That takes care of temporal and spatial ideas. The last two over there, empathy and clarity, are two things that it's not really easy to come up with visual representations for. I think that they are the deepest level of doing animation is getting empathy and clarity. Now, in the original 12 principles of animation, they would be considered things that were part of clarity would be part of staging, but I think empathy is my take on appeal and what happens when appeal and all of the other things that you've done right sort of work. And the reason I feel that way is because empathy to me means that people can look at your character and understand that's a living, breathing thing. They might not understand exactly why the person is doing what they're doing yet, or the character, but they understand that that thing has intention. So I think that's why it's important for motion graphics, is because when we do motion stuff, it's not always a character. It's not always a character that has a plot that they're trying to get to. A lot of times for us, it's like, guy picks up a data point and you're like, what the hell? Okay, what is his motivation for picking up a data point? I don't know, but if I can make him look like he's thinking about doing it, it at least gives the viewer a sense that it's a person, that it has personality. And to me, that's what empathy is. Appeal was something that they talked about back in the original days of animation, because they wanted people to understand that cartoons were not, were believable. So my idea for that is to make it not just cartoons. It should be that everything can be an object that has intention, which is important in motion graphics. We've done stuff where it's just a line moving through a scene, and if you move the line in the right way, it can start to feel like that line has a personality, and it starts to feel like it's making decisions. So that's what I believe empathy is if you can make something feel like it's making choices and has thoughts and feelings. And I think that's a tough one to do. You have to understand a lot about all of the other things that we've talked about. You have to be pretty well rounded before that can come into play. And the last one that was in the bunch for the emotional aspect of things was clarity. And to me, I think clarity is a more modern way of thinking about staging. When the original Disney animators named staging, they were literally thinking about staging a teleplay or some sort of a film where it was a very flat thing that the audience was looking at, and they needed to make sure that the audience could look at that instantly and understand what was going on there and know where to look and all of that stuff. But they had to think about it like a set dresser would, and all of this stuff. I think that's one way to do it. And if you're doing narrative, full-blown character animation, you're still thinking about staging. You're still thinking about how your silhouettes read and all of that stuff. But I do think that thinking about it as staging is a little bit too character specific, a little bit too narrative specific. So I like to think about it as clarity is, if I don't have a single character on my screen, if I don't have a single recognizable object on my screen, if I've got shapes that are supposed to represent data moving into a cloud, which by God we do a lot of, can somebody look at it and get what I'm trying to say? That's clarity to me. Obviously, if you've got a character and they're standing there and they're doing something, you want the audience to understand what they're doing. And you can pull some of those ideas of staging and silhouettes and all that stuff into that. But if the rest of the scene is unclear, and there's no visual hierarchy, your audience doesn't know where to look, then it doesn't make any sense. So that's what I think about staging and clarity. I think that they are, if you look at the three buckets that I had going for where I had categorized things. I think it's sort of the background of everything. It's the surface that it's the choices you make that are in the background that inform so much about what the objects in your animation are thinking. And if you don't have any thinking things and you just are literally putting data points on the screen, then all you really need to care about is, can people understand this? And that would be taking care of clarity. But if you've got crap timing and, no art thought, no thought to given to where the things are moving through space, then you're selling your animation a little bit short. So that's why I like to think about these in the buckets, from temporal to spatial to emotional. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so that's those are my thoughts on the principles of animation. Hopefully that gave you guys something to think about. Thank you guys for checking it out. Hope you're staying safe and sane, and hope you have some awesome people to walk in on your live stream for you, and let's all try to get through this craziness together. Thanks, guys.